So Sergio Parise was there in the stands. We saw a little bit of him clapping in slow motion at the time. However, I think this Italy team now has grown to a point where we're kind of beyond seeing lots and lots of slow-mo clapping Sergio Parise's in the stands. Not enough clapping Martin Castrogiovanni's though.
No.
Who I have modelled myself after by being hairy and fat. I do think this Italy team though is now growing beyond all the teams of the past.
Yeah.
And we are looking at a world in which this is a couple of years away from being maybe the best Italy team there's ever been.
Yeah.
Competing with a team from the 90s.
First and foremost, I'm going to try and go for the Leonardo Galdini and become bald and fat instead of hairy and fat. But yes, they haven't yet lived up to, of course, their best result against the All Blacks, which was the 0-0 draw of 2019.
Yes.
The swan song of Sergio Parise, of course. But yeah, it's an interesting one because it's a difficult game to gauge where you expect Italy to come against the All Blacks, because this All Blacks team are still really bloody good.
Yes.
I think sometimes there are warped perceptions of just how good they are.
I think a lot of people are confused by how good they are now.
They are.
Because I think they're a very different team to even a year ago, never mind 5 years ago. And a lot of
But
people
they always
still have
put these games to the sword.
team
And
in their heads,
yeah, they're such a difficult team to play against.
Yeah.
And I think that the scoreline that was expected of this game probably would have and should have been just above what actually happened.
Yeah, it should have been like low 40s, high 30s probably.
Yeah.
And instead, we got a different game.
And of course, that is also influenced by the try for Barrett at the end, which was a case of Italy overplaying because they knew basically what's the difference between losing by 13 points and losing by 18 points.
Yeah.
As opposed to what is the difference between we are losing by 13 points and if we try something spectacular and it comes off, we're now only losing by 6 points with a minute to go.
Yeah.
Huge difference.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So they try something, they gamble. It's pretty shit what they try and they gamble. Bowden Barrett is basically the one player in the world who is most likely to score off that. So it is karma that you try that and the opposition score off it. So it is completely correct that is reflected in the scoreline. Yeah. That felt like a bit of a blow that if it was a World Cup game, that would have been the bonus point try for New Zealand. Whereas on the flip side, Italy would have been looking for the losing bonus point, as it were. But yeah, it felt like an entirely fair reflection of the game because New Zealand were definitely the better team.
New Zealand were definitely the best team. And yet I think in future, when we come to speak of that idea of are you looking for a performance or a result, right? And I'm going, well, the performances are improving, but does it count for anything? This is the model now of what we look at, right? Is Italy's performance at the weekend. Because I thought the Italian performance, relative to everything, was exceptional, was brilliant. And New Zealand were the better team. And I think there'll probably be a lot of Kiwi fans out there going, well, why did we only beat Italy by bloody, it was looking like 13 points and it ends up being, 18 in the end. But why was it so close? Why were they so on top of us for so much of the game? But the fact of the matter are, this is a really good Italy team.
Yeah.
This is an exceptional Italy team who came of age and had a frustrating autumn where they were almost beaten by Georgia with a largely changed team. But then they had that game against Argentina where that was a really evenly balanced game where every single chance was finished by Argentina down the other end, Italy probably created as many chances as Argentina, just Argentina took more of Italy's chances than Italy took of their own.
Yeah.
And it became a bit of a nightmare for them.
Yeah.
And here they put far more of it together.
Yeah, and I think there's obviously the demon of what happened at the World Cup last year, which is genuinely
really hanging over them.
Maybe the best performance I've ever seen by a rugby team ever.
Oh, it's up there. Genuinely, it's up there.
That All Black performance against Italy last year where they got 96 points against Italy and against what we thought was a good Italy team going into that. Obviously, it's aged quite a lot in the last year with them winning games in the Six Nations and, it's different because it's a bit topsy-turvy as a year for Italy because their summer was quite ropey. As you say, the Argentine game showed that they're actually a long way off what we kind of think the ceiling for Italy is. Italy, I think, played closer to their current ceiling against the All Blacks than they have in the majority of the games they've played this year.
Yeah.
Both teams' discipline was pretty poor. With the All Blacks, that was a lot of their opportunities to let Italy into the game, came through them giving away penalties, a lot of which were enforced by good Italian attack. And almost the exact same thing happened in reverse, that when Italy started to, it's like what we're saying about Georgia when they played against Italy.
Yeah.
When you're playing against a team like that, you have to step up and really try and be aggressive in your defence, and sometimes you'll come offside. You'll have to be really aggressive in the way you attack the breakdown. Sometimes you'll fall off your feet and you give away a penalty for it. And Italy tried to do that. The All Blacks were really mature in the way they handled that. I don't think they tried to force anything too early.
Yeah.
It's not like they were throwing stupid passes and getting frustrated.
Yeah.
They knew if we keep the ball, eventually they'll get a yellow card. Eventually we'll knock them back at scrum time, which the scrum was really weird in that the All Blacks were more on top, but there was the odd scrum where Fischetti and Spagnuolo would like get on top of them and win a scrum penalty out of it.
I think this is a sign of who this All Blacks team are, right? In that they are a team who finds a way. And in past, traditionally, the only two nations in rugby that always put the foot on throat and batter the teams they should be battering are New Zealand and England.
Yeah.
Right? And all the other teams have games where you go into it against an opposition that is much weaker than them. You know, the kind of the South Sea Islands, the Uruguays and Chiles and so on in the world. And they struggle and they just about get the bonus point right at the end. You know, all the other British and Irish teams have done it. All the other European teams. France lose to them semi-regularly until this new team. South Africa, again, likewise, have had games where they've lost or really struggled, or like, you know, games where it's taken the last 20 minutes to pull away against Georgia and so on. Australia exist still, but England and New Zealand always batter them. They always run away with those games.
Yeah.
And there's just something in the blood and the way rugby's brought up and that kind of, you know, culture, I think, that's the very much led to that. But this New Zealand team instead feel like one who will find a way to win every game by a similar margin. And I think this tour we felt, and we've talked about this in successive weeks, Scott Robertson's DNA and the kind of team he built the Crusaders, they're becoming much, much more similar to this All Blacks team now, you know? I think he is so much closer to having the team he wants them to be. And you can feel an identity growing week on week here. And I think this performance was an extremely good one by Italy, but also the archetypal Scott Robertson All Black performance.
Yeah.
In that the opposition is giving absolutely everything. They're having their best game of the year, arguably, up there with their performance against France. And yet, it isn't going to be enough, you know? And yet, they're going to come up short by 3 scores in the end.
Yeah. I think you mentioned a lot about this being close to the archetype of a Scott Robertson style of play. The guy that we need to give the most praise to out of everybody is Jason Ryan.
I said this during the game, right? He has to be the best scrum coach in the world.
Yeah.
Like, you can talk about Don Human, Tom Harrison, friend of the channel, who have both done absolutely brilliant jobs with the packs they're given. But this New Zealand pack, before he came in, was getting eaten alive by a decent number of scrums. He comes in and suddenly the All Blacks have the second best scrum and the second best maul in the world.
Yeah. When we spoke to Tom Harrison, he referred to New Zealand as having the best at like hooking it to the back and like using the scrum as a way of restarting
a launch
the game.
pad, yeah.
Yes. Now this All Black scrum are really good at being the brutal team who drive you back, get a penalty out of it. As I say, there were a couple of off moments, you know, where there was one just after Spagnuolo came on, there was one really destructive one that Fischetti got out of them. But there's nothing more crushing than when you are a team like Italy, where you're slightly based on like hard work, that kind of thing, but also you have so many attacking launch pads, so many different attacking sets that you can go off, right? When you're trying one of those, you're working really hard, you're really punching above your weight to compete with the All Blacks. You drop one ball from a freak forward pass or something like that, right? The scrum goes down and you give away a scrum penalty, All Blacks are back in your 22.
Yeah.
There is nothing more crushing than that.
Yeah. And the other thing that compounds that for the All Blacks is how patient they've become, you know? And how often they will wait and find the correct moment to strike. And I think this is added to by Beauden Barrett playing 10, who is one of the players, of all the players I've ever seen, right? Beauden Barrett might be the best for having an innate feel for the game, what the game needs in that moment. You know, this modern Beauden Barrett, like, it is his standout attribute, is he can read the energy of a game and the energy of both his team and the opposition better than almost anyone else in the world. You know, he just inherently knows what needs to be done in that moment. Yeah. And you look at the lead up to the Will Jordan try, which comes off a line out. Italy have had a succession of attacks that haven't gone brilliantly, where they've got into 22 and they haven't come away with points. But then they've also had a few big defensive sets where they've withheld the All Blacks, they've had a huge emotional boost, and then they've instantly been back defending there again, right? And this feels like Barrett goes, okay, we're 2 minutes before half time. This is going to be it. So they play wide initially to get right out into the wide channels. And once they've had a couple of decent carries, and they're not even crossing the game line, they're just like decent carries where players stay on their feet for a second longer. And it creates a bit of front football, even if it's not like brilliant, you know, go forward ball. Barrett calls this shape, which is really smart, where we just see they've managed to get Brex pinned on the far side, the main decision maker, the main defensive leader for Italy, totally out the game. As Barrett wraps himself round and Will Jordan wraps round, Italy look for this. They spot them, the two most dangerous players in the Kiwi team. Of course, they're keeping eyes on them. Melancello's watching them the whole time. You've got Pazzarello filling in on the wing as well. They're fine. They've got this covered. Except, then last second, you have two extra players wrap around outside Will Jordan. And this causes Pazzarello to have a moment of going, oh, hold on, they're going to go wide because they've got two of extra players wrapping around. And so instead, when they hit Will Jordan and hit the guy on the outside of Melancello without Brex there, Pazzarello wants to be darting in, but he's been bought by these two extra players wrapping round and goes, okay, he stays out a second, allows the space for Will Jordan to dart right through. He gets into 22, they recycle really well, and they just wait. And Barrett now has that same thing when they're going, okay, we'll wait, we'll hang on. They play forward phase after forward phase after forward phase. If this defence is good and it's strong and it's at them and it's aggressive and they're trying to knock them back and they're kind of meeting them on the game line repeatedly until we get to the final moment. And this is just really smart by Barrett and by Will Jordan. Barrett's eyes the entire time he has the ball are on Paolo Garbisi. So he has lined himself opposite Brex, who is the main decision maker, the main defensive leader for Italy. He knows if he can fix him, he can get him out the game, it doesn't matter. He's the one guy who's going to just make this read. Garbisi's advantage was in between the two centres. He's lodged in here. And so, by just watching Garbisi the entire time, Barrett calls the most simple shape in the world, where you have one player run in, one player run out, you know, the kind of X-Factor ball we used to call it when I was in like Colts level. Ioane running the inside line, then Jordan running outside. And all he does is keep his eye on Garbisi for which one he goes for. And literally the split second that he turns his hips in on Ioane, he sees Garbisi's eyes are on Ioane, he just passes out the back to Jordan, who skips around the tackle with Mancello and scores.
It's a stitch up.
And yeah, it's just like two brilliant calls and a moment of patience from Bowden Barrett unlocks that. And then Will Jordan hitting two phenomenal lines.
And that overload as well and changing the picture that the Italian defence are looking at. Like, Brex is a really good defensive reader. Melancello's a great defender in terms of physicality and his, like, Jacqueline's breakdown work and everything. But if you can change the picture and make him think a little bit more, it just piles that pressure on Brex a little bit. You know, and as you say, Pazzarello on the outside. The decision makers, if you can overwhelm them a little bit more, you probably can target Garbisi and Melancello in that midfield a little bit more. I want to look at as well the Mark Talea tried towards the end. Very, very similar scenario with how Bowden Barrett calls this. This is such a common move at the moment where you run a little hit/boot player off 12, right? They hit 12, 10 slides into his boot, 13 runs the hard line.
The Hugh Pelosi shape, as we've always called it.
As we like to call it, yeah, but the thing is everyone runs it
now.
And everybody always run it, but they've run it the best in the past. Anyway, they run such a good variation of this here because it looks like they're running that. Teams are obviously, they know how to defend this because people have been playing this for so long. And so they run a variation of this that I've not actually seen used yet, where they play this one out, that they go to 12, and instead of hitting 10 in the boot, they hit 13 and then play the exact same thing off him. Damien McKenzie, who's on at fullback at this point, runs the hard line off Rico Ioane. And it's a really nice touch by Leonard Brown. He just takes himself out the game. They're a bit wider. And suddenly, Italy have tightened themselves up. And for what reason, you know? Bowden Barrett slid himself into an extra boot a little bit further out than they expected. And Italy are now tight for no reason. They get a decent contact on Ioane, and obviously the ball ends up bouncing backwards. It's a little bit fortuitous, but it's such a good play, it's such a good setup, that there's enough space there that Barrett can just run onto the ball, pick it up, and fling it wide for Talea, who's pretty much unmarked on that edge. Like, it's such a great set play, and as you say, like, they've changed the picture that's in front of Melancello and Brex, and Zanon is on at this point, you know?
And I thought Tommaso Melancello has had a brilliant year, had a brilliant game.
Yes.
The All Blacks did manage to get change out of him defensively. You know, I think in attack he was everywhere. He made a couple of brilliant turnovers, but they just overload him for options again and again and again. And he made the right choice maybe 85% of the time, but that 15% can lead to 30 metres of territory, or in one case, a try that decides the game.
It makes you think, like, if you're Ireland or a team like that in Six Nations, even Scotland actually, the more you can make him make decisions and take him out of the game a little bit, you know, the harder it's going to be for Brex.
It also emphasises the way this Italian team is growing.
Yeah.
So you look at the Six Nations and they were very good, but they weren't, I don't think, at the level they're at here. And what we're seeing is a steady growth, and they're going through phases. So you track all the way back to when Conor O'Shea is in his last season as head coach, director of rugby with Italy, And he has a bunch of those old players. He takes them to 2019, but he also brings through the first few of this new crop of players who, under him and Steve Abood, have redeveloped completely their academy pathways and have started to beat teams like England and France and South Africa at age grade levels. And then, from there, he picks the likes of Marco Zanon, Stephen Varney, kind of get their first few caps under him. The following year, then, Franco Smith comes in, and he goes, okay, we've lost a lot of experience in the likes of Parise, Gherardini, Dean Budd, all the experience. Cittadini, great player. Pretty much all of their players over the age of 30 have retired. However, they still have this core of players in their late 20s who hadn't been cutting it international level. And he goes, instead of building a team around these guys who are more experienced, I'm going to gut the team entirely and bring through this team of 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds and just believe in them and just go, you guys are good enough. Let's give this a go, you know?
Yeah.
So he brings Paolo Garbisi in after having played 3 or 4 games of professional rugby, gives him his debut, he scores that brilliant try against Ireland. And these players start to perform and they start to step up.
Yeah.
And they're losing games, but they're having odd moments where they get in control, you know, where they manage to force things. I talked about this on the Wales video. Manage to force the odd thing against Ireland or against England, and moments where they get on top, or they create a try out of nowhere. There's a brilliant try that Jakob Petrula scored where they kind of built that out of just getting on top for a sequence of phases. And that isn't enough because they're still losing by 30 odd points. And if you just look at the score lines, you're then going, oh, they're not brilliant, are they? But if you're watching the games, you can go, okay, there's something there to work with.
Sure.
You then go to 2022 and 2023, and suddenly those players and those teams have been playing international rugby. They've got 20-odd caps now, and they're starting to win games. They win that game against Wales, that last-minute try from Padovani and Capelwitso combining, and that becomes what they need to kick on. That autumn, they beat Australia for the first time ever, and things are starting to change. They're starting to build that confidence to win the odd game. And those performances the following year become much more consistent. And they go from the odd game, they'll put it all together and they'll beat someone, to they're now performing at that level in every single match. And so we have seen every game they played this year, if they have been pretty level. The only game where they got slaughtered, where they got battered, I mean, there was Ireland didn't go great, but they still managed to put up a bit of performance there. And that was the number 1 team in the world at the time. And in the Argentina game, which was a pretty level game, they just had an awful lot of bad luck and poor decisions and switching off and so on went against them.
Which is legit still, obviously,
yeah.
But yeah.
But if they've got to a point where they're putting in a pretty consistent performance in 11 of their 12 games this year, where before it was, you know, it started as no games, but you had something to work with, that then became putting in odd performance in 2 or 3 games, that then became 5 or 6 games, and it's now at the point where it's almost every game.
It's definitely a big step up, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's going to become a point in like a year's time where every single week we're going like, oh, is it another 50th cap for Italy?
Yeah.
That's going to start happening, and that will make a difference when
thing
everyone's
about
at that stage.
This game in particular, though, that I think is most important, and why I think it's a step up from even the France game, you know, because France had a pretty poor afternoon.
They did, yeah.
And I don't think New Zealand did. I thought New Zealand won good form. They played well.
Agreed.
They're not reliant on that anymore because Italy, and if you look at the game, if you go through it, if you take out every moment where someone scores points and you cut it off just before the end of every sequence of play, right? You could look at that game and not know who won.
Yeah.
And Italy created enough moments to win that game. And that is what you're going to be looking at. You know, it's the same thing I think about England at the minute, right?
They do need to start finishing them.
England are creating enough chances to win games.
Yeah.
But this is the stage, right? They're at kind of, I think, the penultimate stage of their development. The next stage is to start taking more of those chances.
Yeah.
And they need to go from taking, instead, 3, they took 3 of their maybe like 9 or 10 chances they created. They need to be turning it from 3 to 7 or 8, which is what the best teams take, you know, because you're never going to take 100%. But if they can start turning that to 6 or 7 next year, then they're going to start beating pretty much everyone, you know, or anyone rather than everyone. But I think this showed that Italy are moving along at a rate of absolute knots.
Yeah.
And they created enough moments to win that game.
Yeah.
And that is the most important thing, because no Italy team has ever done that against the All Blacks before. Even in that draw in 2019, when it finished 0-0, that was basically because no one caught a ball for the entire match, because it was in a typhoon. Italy's best result was in 1991 World Cup. They lost by 10 points to the All Blacks, but that was a very, very different game.
Yeah.
4-point tries. You know, if you converted it now, it would have been a bigger loss than we had at the weekend.
Sure. I think The other thing with Italy, the other main change is like they are actually starting to develop a bit of depth as well.
Yeah.
I think they're still in the first phase of the depth
Yeah.
bit. I think that they are rightfully prioritising the main squads that will be playing in the Six Nations and World Cup, kind of like big games. But you are looking at like there was a moment when they had their yellow card for Ferrari in the second half. And like they brought off Capuozzo there, which a lot of people would have been quite surprised. I was quite surprised by it. I was thinking like, no, why wouldn't you bring off Trula? And it's like, no, actually, Trula's having a really good game defensively, and like,
And just the fact that they picked Trula, over Liner. And again, you go back a few years and they'd be going, well, that guy played in the Premiership, let's pick him. But actually,
and Gallagher as well, who's been on good form.
Trula is better in the air. He is physically a better tackler, and that is what they needed in this game. They can pick a horses for courses thing. But if they're playing...
In the Six Nations, it'll be Liner again, and that's fine.
Well, when they're playing Argentina, right, and they want the best attacking lineup they can pick, they put Liner in.
Yeah.
And they can afford to make odd decisions like that. See Dino Lam, starting over Canone, who is an absolute workhorse. Dino Lam is a bit more athletic, bit quicker, and you can use that. Him and Roots, I thought,
will
were
pay off.
exceptional.
It will pay off having these.
You need to build that squad. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that Quesada's doing incredibly smartly.
Yeah, I think, speaking of second row, I think Rutzer was one of the standout names for me for Italy. I think he was psychotic and brilliant at the line out. As you say, like Menincello was great until he had moments where he was targeted a little bit, but generally was fantastic.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, the best player for Italy on the park was Rutzer.
Yeah.
I think overall, like we've talked about Barrett for New Zealand, I think Cam Roigard had another game. Like he's stringing together such a good group of games where he's not only managing the tempo of the attack, but he's managing like how do we exit and stuff like that. And that is invaluable for a scrum half who plays like Cam Roigard does to develop at this point in his career.
1 year on from Aaron Smith's last game, and this match obviously being TJ Perinara's last game.
Yeah.
There was, I think 12 months ago, a bit of a concern around who takes over this All Blacks 9 shirt, because you had Ratimer and you had Roigard and you had Finlay Christie, but none of them had laid down what they could do at international level.
Sure.
They were all promising youngsters who played well at Super Rugby level. And what we've seen this tour, I think, even more than the year before, is Roigard really state that claim and say, no, I'm the heir to Aaron Smith. I'm the next guy.
It still feels slightly wrong watching the All Blacks without Aaron Smith.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just my obsession with Aaron Smith.
But that's just watching the 87 games back. Who is this David Kirk character? What's he doing here? Point is, Italy, really good. And this is a performance they can build off, right? Brexit afterwards, we want to take this to the Six Nations, this level of performance. And if they do, they will definitely beat Wales. I think they can probably beat Scotland again.
Yeah.
I think this was a better performance than Scotland putting against South Africa in their other big test. And I will be hugely encouraged by what Italy gave, but also hugely encouraged by what the All Blacks gave, right?
Yeah.
That was, in many ways, Italy gave a performance less clinical, but in terms of their defensive ferocity and accuracy tactically and technically, to what Argentina did in 2020.
It's a building block for sure for Italy.
But
as you say, like it is the sheer maturity New Zealand have now. There are eras of the All Blacks who probably would have still scraped a win in that game, but it would have been scraped. It would have been like, give it to Mark Talea and see if he can go the length of the distance.
There are also, though, eras of the All Blacks where they pick a weaker team for this game and they'd lose.
Yeah.
And they didn't. And that's partly credit to Scott Robertson for picking a strong team and recognising the threat that Italy are, but also credit for the trust and belief and finding a wayness that he's installed in this team.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it was a great performance. It was a good game to watch, actually. I think it was very scrappy.
Game of the
weekend. Yeah, but enjoyable. So
yeah.
Forza the All Blacks as well.
Scrappy but enjoyable hopefully describes this video.
Yeah, sure.
And my Martin Castrogiovanni era look.